Hi, I'm Patsy Thompson, and in today's video I'm going to show you even more fun things you can do with fabric and your Sizzix machine. Now you already know the basics of how to cut some really neat applique shapes using Sizzix cutting dies, so today I'll be showing you some other cool things you may not know about your Sizzix machine. Did you know that you can use other manufacturers' dies with your Sizzix machine? Let's start off with this AccuQuilt die that has a plume or teardrop shapes on it. Any AccuQuilt or AccuCut die that's 6 inches wide or less will fit into your Sizzix machine, and that opens up a whole lot more dies for you. If you look at an AccuQuilt die next to a Sizzix die, you'll see that the AccuQuilt die is a bit thinner than the Sizzix die, so we're going to need to add a thin shim into our system. This is not a big deal. I use a used Priority Mail envelope that I've cut into 2 pieces. I lay these on the bed of my machine and they'll act as my shim. Next, I layer my pieces of fabric bonded to fusible web onto the foam side of the AccuQuilt die just like I do when I'm using a Sizzix die. I then load my cutting pad sandwich that holds the die and fabric onto my bed, and I move the sandwich through with my thin cardboard shim underneath. When it comes out on the other side, I've got all my teardrop shapes nicely cut. So remember, if the AccuQuilt die is 6 inches wide or less, you can use it in your Big Shot machine. You can also cut with Spellbinder dies and Boss Cuts dies on your Sizzix machine, but they'll cut papers rather than fabrics. Know that when you use them, you'll also use the multi-purpose platform that came along with your machine. A Spellbinder die will generally come with many sizes of the same die shape within a packet, just like this one here, and I'm going to demo it really quickly because it's only going to work for you on paper. Now I know just what you're asking yourself. You're wondering if you can take a Sizzix die and use that to cut shapes on your AccuQuilt Go or your AccuQuilt Go Baby machine. Unfortunately, no. And the reason why is a Sizzix die is much thicker than an AccuQuilt die, so it won't fit in through that narrow part of the AccuQuilt Go machine. But let's look now at some other cool stuff we can do with our Sizzix machines. Did you know that you can cut all kinds of other materials on your Big Shot machine? Here's a wool applique piece that I've been hand appliquing, and all the wools and different blended wool felts were cut using my Big Shot machine. Now that may surprise you because the material is so thick, but the pieces were very easy to cut. Let's start by loading some woven wool layers onto the Big Shot, and I want you to notice just how thick one single layer is. Now I'm only putting 2 layers on because that's all I need, but this machine can cut more than 2 of these really thick wool layers. I've got to tell you that I was really thinking this wouldn't go well, that the fabric would come out a totally frayed mess, but watch what happens as my pieces come out the other side. Fabulous! Now let's take a look at wool felts and wool felt blends. This time, I'm loading different wool felts onto my leaf die. Now I've got wool rayon blends, 100% wool, and bamboo rayon blend felts in here. You can see that these are all on the thick side, but they still cut beautifully in my Sizzix Big Shot. Let's see how they look as they come out the other side. And again, they're fabulous! Beautiful clean edges, and they are ready to be appliqued to my next project. And I can really easily clean off all the wool fluff off my die just by using a lint roller. Now you're probably wondering just how many layers of wool you can place onto your Sizzix die. And honestly, it all depends on exactly what it is that you're loading onto that die. If you look at wools, there's a huge variation in the thickness of different types of wool. So this is one of those situations that's really trial and error. You're going to have to just put some on and see what it will cut. My advice is start with 1 to 2 layers and work your way up. Now you may not know that your Sizzix machine is also an embossing machine. You can use it to add all kinds of cool textures to papers and cardstock and grunge board, and those can then be cut into all kinds of shapes. It's as simple as placing the material into an embossing folder and then running it through the machine. Notice that you need to use the multi-purpose platform when you're doing this, so the folder is raised high enough to be compressed. When you open it up after it's been run through, you see just what kinds of great texture can be created. But maybe you're not someone who's into paper crafts. You're a fabric person like me. So how does this apply to you? Now you may be interested to know that you can also emboss fabric. Yes, you can also emboss fabric. My big interest here is working in fusible applique, so I'm going to show you how I emboss applique shapes. First, this is a piece of fabric and I've fused a piece of Peltex interfacing to the wrong side of it. You don't actually have to do this step, but I do it because it will help me get a more pronounced embossing. And now I'm going to cut this fabric on my Big Shot, and I do this the same way I always cut fabric. I place my die onto a cutting pad, place my fabric Peltex layer, and then I cover it with a second cutting pad, and it's ready to be run through the machine. When it comes out the other side, I've got this lovely bird shape. And now I'm going to emboss this bird or give it a texture. I begin with my multi-purpose platform, then I place my bird inside an embossing folder, then cover the folder with a cutting pad. I place all 3 layers onto my Big Shot platform and then turn the crank. When they come out the other side, I've got a bird with some very cool texture to it. I can stitch this directly to my quilt or fuse it to my quilt, and because of that Peltex layer, the embossed texture is much deeper. Notice that I used my Priority Mail envelope shims to do this embossing. That's not at all required or necessary, but I added it to add even deeper embossing. And if you like living on the wild side, know that you can also cut and emboss light metals using your Sizzix machine, and these can add some real interest to your quilted wall hangings. You can stitch light metals directly to a quilt, but if you're looking for some really deep texturizing on fabric, you can also fuse a piece of light metal to the wrong side of fabric and then cut and emboss that shape just as we did before with the Peltex. I'm using a 40 gauge metal here, and believe it or not, these pieces can also be stitched to your quilted wall hanging, and I use a Microtep sharp needle for that. You wouldn't want to use this technique on a quilt that you'd wash, but it's a way to add a lot of interest to a wall hanging. Take some time to play around with your Sizzix machine like I am, and you'll find that there is just no end to the fun that can be had with it. As you can see here, you can actually heighten the embossed textural effect by simply gently rubbing a Shiva paint stick or other media across the top of the bird. Isn't this lovely? And you can see here that the fabric embossed with a light metal layer is a bit deeper than the fabric embossed with Peltex. Now get to your machine and start playing.